All right, this is the final lecture on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. In this lecture, we're going to be covering, consequently, the final chapter of the book Phenomenology of Spirit, titled Absolute Knowing, which is the culmination and you could say the end point of Hegel's phenomenological logic as it relates to the phenomenological drama of the historical process. So, the phenomenology of spirit, absolute knowing, what is it? Hegel takes us through, in the book Phenomenology of Spirit, the entire drama of spirit. That is, the drama that starts with consciousness, the drama that develops into self-consciousness, into the development of rationality, the development of spiritual life, the development of religious life, and then ultimately the state of absolute knowing, which Hegel tells us is a symmetry between the objective form and subjective thought. Leading up to absolute knowing, we have thus a constant asymmetry in the motion and the logic of spiritual development. Here, in the actual state of absolute knowing itself, we have a self-active conceptual universality that is spirit's own motion, spirit's own knowing is the same as universal motion and universal knowing, and this is conceptualized by Hegel as the return of spirit back to itself. In other words, the entire phenomenological drama is as if there was a falling away from self, an externalization of self, and a return to self to a true and a real self-determination. Thus, there's a large-scale and many small-scale oscillations of spirit in between this externalization and self-determination motion. Finally, Hegel takes us through his understanding of where his philosophical understanding is placed within the philosophical history of the absolute itself, taking us through Descartes' understanding of the absolute, Spinoza's, Leibniz, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, which is the quartet, including Hegel, of German idealists, that running from Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and of course Hegel himself. So, consequently, most philosophy after Hegel is categorized as post-Hegelian philosophy. And so having a complete or total understanding of the phenomenology of spirit is very important for philosophers to situate their work in relationship to the ongoing philosophical history of the absolute, which we might see further developed in works like Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Husserl, and so on and so on. The traditional narrative and historical lineage of philosophy. So, starting with a slide that I showed in the last lecture on natural religion, here adding the next step and the final step, that being the step of absolute knowing, here going through again an overview of the entire text. It should be said that all of these dialectical motions, again, processual opposites between consciousness, self-consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, reason and spirit, spirit and religion, religion and absolute knowing, are the self, Hegel will tell us, as restless negativity. The spirit or the phenomenological experience of consciousness itself is constantly oscillating between asymmetries between its subjective thought and its objective form. Consequently, all of its objective picture thought, as Hegel will tell us, is the result of a discord, a split, gap within spirit itself, a negativity, and ultimately the state of absolute knowing is the realization or the recognition that the self is this negativity. And that's the crucial perspectival shift between spirit, or the phenomenology of consciousness before absolute knowing, and the spirit or the phenomenology of consciousness after absolute knowing. That again being the distinction between a state of restless negativity in an asymmetrical relationship to objective form, and coming to realize that the self is this negativity. Quoting Hegel, "The spirit of the revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such, or what is the same, its actual self-consciousness is not the object of its consciousness. Spirit itself as a whole, and the self-differentiated moments within it, fall within the sphere of picture thinking and in the form of objectivity. The object is in part immediate being, corresponding to the understanding. It is, as a totality, the movement of the universal through determination to individuality, as also the reverse movement from individuality through superseded individuality or through determination to the universal. It is therefore in accordance with these three determinations that consciousness must know the object as itself. However, this knowing is to be indicated only in its process of coming to be, or in the moments which belong to consciousness as such, the moments of the notion proper or of pure knowing in the form of shapes of consciousness." End quote. So what Hegel is saying here is that in the asymmetrical motion of spirit between consciousness and self-consciousness, self-consciousness and reason, reason and spirit, spirit and religion, religion and absolute knowing, spirit is regulated by picture thinking in the form of objectivity. Of course, the paradox here is that what many people call materialism, what many people call objective materialism, is in fact picture thinking and what Hegel would call idealism. So working up to the knowing of the self itself, rather than the picture thinking of the self, is this transition to pure knowing, and all of the moments leading up to that were the coming to be, or the coming into form of this self-knowing. So let's go through all of these stages, and this will be an in-depth analysis of the book as a whole, as Hegel, throughout the last chapter, will recount the stages which he had formally described in previous chapters. Here in the phenomenological drama, we will have two opposites. On this slide, we have sense immediacy and abstract understanding. In the middle, we'll have the negative term, meaning the term which is coming into being. In this state, it is consciousness itself. So there is a oscillation between sense immediacy. You could imagine here very simply the coming into being of an infant, the development of an infant, where what its consciousness is a pure sense immediacy. And of course, there is an oscillation here between sense immediacy and the abstract understanding. For example, coming to name sensed immediacy, mama, dada. And here comes into development the early form of consciousness in the phenomenological drama. Moving on to the next stage, we have the formation of rational consciousness between the mapping of material and the mind in itself. That being that there is a side or an oscillation here between the consciousness sort of mapping its territory, understanding the universe, understanding the world from local to global, and then trying to understand the mind in itself, which is doing the mapping. You could say this is movement from the externalization of logic to the understanding of logic itself, the mind's own logic. And here we have the coming into being of rational consciousness. Moving on to the next stage, we have the dynamics of intersubjectivity and the desire for recognition, where we get the formation of a deeper self-consciousness, a consciousness that can reflect on itself and can understand itself on a deeper order through the drama of dealing with other subjects and its own desire to be seen, to be heard, to be felt by other subjectivity, and to situate itself within the social historical order of spirit. Next, we have an oscillation between hedonism, or the pleasure of the subject, the pleasure of the self, and utilitarian life, what Hegel talks about in the formation of pragmatic enlightenment. Hegel talks a lot about utilitarianism before dialecticizing it, as the ground and the formation of a conflict between family and state life. Of course, on one end of this oscillation, hedonism, you have a type of behavioral movement or tendency of spirit, which is in some sense in opposition to family and state life, which matures itself, which develops and cultivates itself in utilitarian life, that is a life which is in service to higher order social structures like the family and the state. Then we have family and state conflict, which is coming out of a oscillation between ethical life and the higher order social phenomena which utilitarian function developed, like family and state orders. Inherently, there is conflict in these orders, and the ethical determination of spirit in this oscillation is the birth of spiritual life proper. Spiritual life thus develops out of conflict, ethical conflict, between intimate others and public others, you could say, where a higher order understanding of spirit is needed to continue the organization. Finally, we have one more stage after this. Then we have the development of an oscillation between deep insight, or what Hegel frequently refers to as conscience, and conflict between consciences. In other words, it is one thing for spirit to have a deep understanding of its own conscience, what we might call individual spirituality, and definitely coming out of spiritual life itself, and the necessary conflict between different consciences. And the conflict from different consciences is basically going to be, the logic of this conflict is going to produce a beyond of individual conscience, a beyond of individual insight in the formation of religious life. And religious life is, again, this beyond of any individual. And that is, in essence, what we covered in the last lecture. Finally, we have an oscillation between this religious beyond, again, the beyond of conscious conflict between subjects, and the formation of divine society, where we start to see the birth of what Hegel refers to as absolute knowledge, and this absolute knowledge being, in some sense, the necessary disposition of spirit to enact and manifest concretely the divine society. So here I'm going to just give some short, brief quotes from Hegel that sort of encapsulate the way Hegel is describing these dialectical oscillations in the final chapter of Absolute Knowledge. First, on the formation of rational consciousness. We saw observing reason seeking and finding itself in this indifferent thing, i.e., we saw it equally conscious of its action being external to it, as it was conscious of the object only as an immediate object, end quote. So we see here Hegel describing rational consciousness, and he is going to be describing the stages that he had previously described in earlier chapters. Here, part of his explication and explanation of absolute knowledge involves re-summarizing some of the stages or some of the phenomenological drama that leads up to absolute knowledge. Next, the quote on family state life. The thing is I, in itself it is nothing. It has meaning only in the relation only through the I and its connection with it. Things are simply useful and to be considered only from the standpoint of utility. This moment manifested itself for consciousness in enlightenment, end quote. So here you have, again, going back to rational consciousness, You have the development of basically the mapping of external matter, what Hegel's calling the indifferent thing, and you have the mapping of the mind itself, an understanding of the internal logic and the way in which this internal logic is mediating its external object. Then in the emergence of family and state life, you have the dialecticization of utilitarianism, what Hegel described in the, again, the conflict between family and state life. Now going to spiritual life and religious life. Quote, consciousness knows that being is simply and solely pure willing and knowing. Anything else has only unessential being, i.e. not intrinsic being, only its empty husk. In the same measure that moral self-consciousness lets determinate being go free from the self, so too in its conception of the world it takes it back again into itself, end quote. So here you have the development of spiritual life, which is basically Hegel saying that consciousness develops itself to an understanding that only its willing and knowing is the essential being. Everything else is unessential being. This is much different, of course, from the the emergence of rational consciousness and the development of the family and state life. Finally, religious life, what we covered in the last lecture. Quote, finally, as conscience, it is no longer this continual alternation of existence being placed in the self and vice versa. It knows that its existence as such is the pure certainty of itself. The objective element into which it puts itself forth when it acts is nothing other than the self's pure knowledge of itself. And from this, end quote, and from this state of consciousness, we get the emergence of religious life in the conflict between consciences which are taking this as its basic spiritual disposition. So all of this to say, basically, that Hegel has taken us through the phenomenological drama. The phenomenological drama are these, as we've covered in the slides I was just showing. This is the absolute as a discontinuous series of experienced events, different selves. Again, the formation of consciousness, the formation of self-consciousness, the formation of rational consciousness, the formation of spiritual consciousness, the formation of religious consciousness. This is governed by a type of restless negativity. Again, all of this is described on the left-hand side of the screen. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the transition to absolute knowledge, which is the absolute as a continuous series of experienced events. In other words, what is experienced in the phenomenological drama as a discontinuous series of experienced events is, from the point of view of absolute knowledge, a continuous series of experienced events. And this is the major difference between a dialectical consciousness, a consciousness that has gone through the phenomenological drama, and so you could say a non-dialectical consciousness, a consciousness that is still experiencing itself as moving through the phenomenological drama. And again, I want to emphasize the main distinction here being the distinction between the self as a restless negativity, moving through the phenomenological drama, and the self as negativity as such, which is capable of perceiving in a different way, which is capable of acting and moving within the phenomenological drama in a different way. Here just summarizing that absolute knowledge sees sense immediacy to active universality as a totality. It is capable of holding all of this restless negativity in itself as negativity as such. Here, quoting Hegel. These are the moments of which the reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness proper is composed. By themselves they are single and separate, and it is solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this reconciliation. The last of these moments is necessarily this unity itself, and, as is evident, it binds them all into itself. The spirit that, in its existence, is certain of itself, has for the element of existence nothing else but this knowledge of itself. When it declares that what it does out of a conviction of duty, this utterance is the validating of its action. Here, therefore, actuality, as well as immediate existence, has for self-consciousness no other significance than that of being a pure knowing, partly of this purely individual self, partly of knowledge as universal. In this, the third moment, the universality or essence, counts only as knowledge of I equals I. this individual self which is immediately a pure knowing or a universal, end quote. So here you see a description of what I showed you on the previous slide, namely that in the phenomenological drama, each of the moments of spirit are quote-unquote single and separate, and the spiritual unity of them is only constituted on that level. Whereas on the level of absolute knowing, all of these moments are necessarily bound all into itself, that is, all into the self itself as negativity. So the self comes to see itself as a pure knowing or a universal pure knowing, and this is, in some sense, the conclusion of the self or spirit's own logical development. So the state of absolute knowledge itself. The self comes to see itself as all the essential forms of objectivity we went through, again, naming them from consciousness to religious consciousness, are identical with the thinking subject. So all were necessarily produced by the thinking subject itself or the self itself. However, the thinking subject itself and not its picture thinking and not its externalized objectivity is the ever-active principle of conceptual universality, which is its own self-determining motion, which is its own self-determining wheel, if you like. And the recognition here on this level that its conceptual grasp of objects is its externalization of itself, whether that's on the level of self-consciousness, whether that's on the level of rational consciousness, whether that's on the level of spiritual or religious consciousness, is always grasping itself. It's always interacting with itself. It's always trying to deepen its understanding of self, ultimately to the level of absolute knowledge. Here, quote, "This last shape of spirit, the spirit which at the same time gives its complete and true content the form of the self, and thereby realizes its notion as remaining in its notion in this realization, this is absolute knowing. It is spirit that knows itself in the shape of spirit, or a comprehensive knowing. It has a content which it differentiates from itself, for it is pure negativity, or the dividing of itself. It is consciousness. This content is, in its difference, itself the I, for it is the movement of superseding itself, or the same pure negativity that the I is. In it, as differentiated, the I is reflected into itself. It is only when the I communes with itself in its otherness that the content is comprehended," end quote. So here again saying that on the level of absolute knowing, the notion, the self and the self-notion are recognized as remaining the same. This is absolute knowing. There is no longer this gap or asymmetry in itself, which is a restless negativity, because the self has come to see itself as this negativity itself, as Hegel's saying here, for it is pure negativity or the dividing of itself. So it has always been dividing itself. It is this consciousness. And so everything has been, up to this point, a superseding of itself. You could say an overcoming of itself. So Hegel here's dialectic in the phenomenological drama is always this overcoming of a gap, always this overcoming of an asymmetry, which in some sense gets reconciled on the deepest possible level in the state of absolute knowing, when it comes to see that its communion here is with otherness. So how he ends, the I communes with itself in its otherness. And I think this is really the crucial notion for absolute knowing. A subject of absolute knowing has come to see otherness as itself. It no longer sees this as discordant with itself. It no longer sees this as something to be overcome, necessarily. So here, again, to deepen our understanding of absolute knowing, on the left-hand side, you see a repetition of what was on the previous slide, namely that all essential forms of objectivity are identical with the thinking subject. That is, objectivity is subjective in the fullness of the phenomenological drama, and the thinking subject is the self-active conceptual universal. Again, this is taking the objective universal from something that's externalized by spirit to something that is a self-determining spirit, since whatever the conceptual grasps as an object is grasping itself. Now, the important point on this slide is on the right-hand side in the distinction between Kant and Hegel. So for Kant, the thing in itself is something that is impossible. The thing in itself is something that's external, something that's impossible for the subject to grasp, on the side of the thinking subject's conceptual synthesis, which Kant labels as contradictory. What Hegel does is merely shift this notion of the thing in itself to nothing different than the thinking subject's conceptual synthesis. And what you get here is a perspectival shift. Merely, there's no difference in wording. There's merely a perspectival shift on the same thing, namely the thinking subject's conceptual powers. Yes, a thinking subject's conceptual synthesis will have contradictions, but for Hegel, these contradictions are leading it to absolute knowing of itself, whereas for Kant, these contradictions are a sign that the entire conceptual process or the entire conceptual capacity is in some sense flawed vis-a-vis getting at the thing in itself. In other words, getting at the truth of reality, let's say. So this is a really important conceptual distinction, and you see here that Hegel's absolute knowledge is really born out of a perspectival shift on Kant's philosophy, which will be important to keep in mind as this lecture progresses. So here, quote, "For this reason it must be said that nothing is known that is not in experience, or as it is also expressed, that is now felt to be true, not given as an inwardly revealed eternal verity, as something sacred that is believed, or whatever other expressions have been used. For experience is just this, that the content, which is spirit, is in itself substance, and therefore an object of consciousness. But this substance, which is spirit, is the process in which spirit becomes what it is in itself. And it is only as this process of reflecting itself into itself that it is in itself truly spirit. It is in itself the movement which is cognition, the transforming of that in itself into that which is for itself, of substance into subject, of the object of consciousness into an object of self-consciousness, i.e., into an object that is just as much superseded or into the notion," end quote. So this quote is really going into this perspectival shift and this important distinction vis-a-vis Kant's philosophy, namely that the spirit becomes what it is only in the process of reflecting itself into itself does it become spirit, and that cognition is the transformation of substance into subject from the object of consciousness into the object of self-consciousness. So, in other words, what Kant places at the level of the noumena is simply the unfinished mediation of spirit's own recognition of itself, of spirit's own deepening understanding of itself, that of a transformation of external substance to subject. Of course, where does this external substance come from? Where does this idea of the noumena come from? It is itself part of the notion. It is itself part of the subject's own projection. That's where the noumena comes from. It comes from the spirit. It comes from the absolute notion. So here, to summarize these levels, you have the final state of the process, namely the phenomenological drama, as the state of absolute knowing. That does not mean that the phenomenological drama ends. That does not mean that the spirit stops being a processual being of a processual nature. It merely means that this discordant asymmetry, this overcoming, this feeling like there is something external, something other that needs to be overcome, that is impossible, is taken in to spirit as itself. That the spirit comes to know this as itself. That's absolute knowing. So again, on the second level, we have the subjective I and the objective other being the ultimate identity of the opposites, where the I comes to see itself as the other. the I comes to see itself as otherness that's not something to be overcome, but merely something to be reflected, since the self itself is pure negativity, as opposed to this restless negativity. And then finally, on the distinction between Kant and Hegel, or you might say phenomena and noumena, we have the understanding from Hegel that the thing in itself is actually on the side of conceptual synthesis and not on the side of the impossible externality. And this creates all the meaningful difference in the world when it comes to the powers of conceptual synthesis, when it comes to the powers of the understanding, since we no longer become lost in a nihilistic state where the truth of reality is forever outside of our grasp. We find the truth of reality through our conceptual powers, through our capacity for conceptual synthesis, not in identifying with our conceptual synthesis as perfect, but on the contrary, seeing the contradictions and the gaps in our conceptual synthesis as a clue to a deeper understanding of the truth in itself. Now, on the level of the philosophical drama, here we get Hegel's explication and explanation of the major figures of modern philosophical history and where he situates himself in this drama, where he situates this in the deepening of spirit's own understanding of itself through philosophy itself. So starting here on the bottom left and going up, we have Descartes' being equals thinking. I think, therefore I am. We have here, moving to Spinoza, the idea that extended being is a single substance, namely that Descartes' thinking and being equation here is extended to the notion that being itself is one substance. Then we get the development of Leibniz, which sees this single substance as necessarily appearing as the object of individual spirituality, namely that Leibniz turns this single substance into what you might call monads, that every monad is reflecting this single substance. And then finally, on the level of the Enlightenment, we have pragmatic utility, namely that this single substance, which is reflected by all individual monads, is seen as something to be engaged with pragmatically, something to be engaged with on utilitarian grounds. So here, to quote Hegel on this philosophical lineage. When, to begin with, the actual self has thus expressed the immediate unity of thought and being, for example, Descartes, the unity of abstract essence and the self abstractly, and when it has expressed the primal light in a purer form, viz., as unity of extension and being, for example, Spinoza, for extension is the simple unity which more nearly resembles pure thought than light does, and in so doing has revived in thought the substance of the Orient. Spirit at once recoils in horror from the abstract unity, from this selfless substantiality, and against it affirms individuality, for example, Leibniz. But only after it has externalized this individuality in the sphere of culture, thereby giving it an existence and establishing it throughout the whole of existence, for example, the Enlightenment and pragmatic utility. So in this quote, you have, as I described in the previous slide, the emergence of Descartes' thinking of the absolute as the equation of thought and being. You have the explanation of Spinoza's absolute as the single substance. You have the development of the individuality of this substance in, for example, Leibniz's monads. And then you have the development of Enlightenment pragmatic utilitarianism in establishing this notion throughout the whole of existence in the sphere of culture. However, the philosophical drama is far from complete. We have to go again to the level of German idealism now. On the level of German idealism, again starting in the left and moving up, we have Kant's transcendent deduction of rational will. Namely, here we have Enlightenment pragmatism taken to the level of the transcendental. Then you have the development from Fichte of the pure self, where instead of the categories of space and time being part of the noumena, let's say, you have the pure self, which can abolish both the flux of time and the differentiation of space, since they are nothing but the pure self itself. You have the development in Schelling's philosophy that the abyss is more primary than the self and its capacity to abolish time and differentiate space. In other words, the abyss of the absolute, the nothingness of the absolute, is primary to both being and thought. You see how this undermines all of the previous notions of the absolute in relationship to Descartes, in relationship to Spinoza, in relationship to Leibniz, in relationship to the Enlightenment, certainly, because it gets a lot darker. It gets a lot darker than Kant. It gets a lot darker than even Fichte. And then finally, you have Hegel, where the self is this abyssal absolute. This is related to Hegel's dialectics of the whole absolute when it comes to restless negativity, which you could see in the formation of all of these philosophers' understanding of the absolute, to the self as negativity itself. In other words, the self is the abyssal absolute. So let's go to a direct quote about all this from Hegel. Quote, "Only after spirit has arrived at the thought of utility and in its absolute freedom has grasped existence as its will, only then does it turn the thought of its inmost depths outwards and enunciate essence as I equals I." For example, Kant. But this I equals I is the movement which reflects itself into itself, for since this identity, being absolute negativity, is absolute difference, the self-identity of the I stands over against this pure difference, which, as pure and at the same time objective to the self-knowing self, has to be expressed as time. Thus, it would now have to be grasped as the unity of thought and time, for example, Fichte. But the difference left to itself, unresting and unhalting time, collapses rather within itself. It is the objective repose of extension, while extension is pure identity with itself, the I, for example, Schelling. In other words, the I is not merely the self, but the identity of the self within itself. But this identity is complete and immediate oneness with self, or this subject is just as much substance, for example, himself, Hegel. And you have the description here from German idealism, the start of German idealism with Kant, where the I equals I is the conceptual synthesis and the noumena, but this conceptual synthesis and the noumena has to be reflected into itself. Here we again deepening of subjectivity with Fichte, with thought and time, grasped as the unity of thought and time, which Kant is not capable of. He simply leaves us with the rational antinomies and this big monstrosity of the noumena. Whereas then in Schelling, you have the unresting and halting time, which collapses rather within itself. That is the abyssal absolute in Schelling. And then the recognition that this abyssal absolute is also the subject, is the self in Hegel. So, to complete this, we then have a deepening of the philosophical drama, specifically on the level of Hegel, specifically on the level of absolute knowledge, as it relates to this entire philosophical process. So from the bottom left and up, AK1 to AK4, we have the self externalizing itself as a single substance, as we saw in Descartes, as we saw in Spinoza. Then on the level of AK2, we have the single substance gaining consciousness and externalization, as we saw in Leibniz, as we saw in Enlightenment consciousness. Then we have the conscious mediation of substance from inner notional oppositions, as we saw in Kant, as we saw in Fichte, and as we saw in Schelling. And then we finally have the logical study as self returning through nature to determine real spirit itself, as we saw in Hegel's absolute knowing, and the self as abyssally absolute. So on the right hand side, you'll see here the philosophical drama as a whole, according to Hegel in the dialectic, which is first the extruded concept, that is the alienated self as time, and then we have the return of the self to itself in the conceptual coincidence with itself, the symmetry of subjective thought and objective form, and that is the abolition of time, namely that in the state of absolute knowing, the spirit or the self experiences time as abolished. And that the whole extrusion of the concept, the extension of the concept, the externalization of the concept, and the return of the concept to itself is the entire journey of the self back to itself. Now I'm going to give four short quotes, which are basically going to be summarizing AK1, AK2, AK3, and AK4 for a conclusion to the phenomenology of spirit and the final passages of the phenomenology of spirit. Quote, for AK1, 804. That first reflection out of immediacy is the subject's differentiation of itself from its substance, or the notion's separation of itself from itself. The I has neither to cling to itself in the form of self-consciousness as against the form of substantiality and objectivity, as if it were afraid of the externalization of itself. The power of spirit lies rather in remaining the self-same spirit in its externalization. So what that means basically is that the spirit externalizes itself. It does not have to be worried about externalizing itself. It does not fear or it's not afraid of this externalization occurring. It does not even have to cling to it. It does not have to be self-conscious of it. It is merely externalizing itself, perhaps just for the fun and the enjoyment of doing so. Then for AK2, 807, quote, the externalization of spirit displays the process of its becoming spirit in the form of free contingent happenings, intuiting its pure self as time outside of it, and equally its being as space. The last becoming of spirit, nature, is its living immediate becoming. Nature, the externalized spirit, is in its existence nothing but the eternal externalization of its continuing existence and the movement which reinstates the subject. End quote. This is AK2 insofar as the externalization of spirit with all of its contingent happenings, its possible description in time and space, is merely the way in which the concept comes, or spirit comes, to reinstate the subject and to regain a knowledge of itself through the formation of individual consciousness. This is, again, described well by Leibniz, acknowledged well by Enlightenment philosophy, pragmatic utilitarianism, and so forth. Now moving on to the final passages of phenomenology of spirit and the final culmination of the understanding of absolute knowledge. First, AK3, the top, 808, quote, but the other side of its becoming, history, is a conscious, self-mediated process, spirit emptied out into time. But this externalization, this kenosis, is equally an externalization of itself. The negative is the negative of itself. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a gallery of images, each of which, endowed with all the riches of spirit, moves thus slowly just because the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth of its substance, end quote. This is basically describing the entire process of spirit's journey in history, the riches of spirit, and its capacity to, he's using here metaphors of penetration and digestion, of course, sexual and oral metaphors, almost as if the spirit is fucking and eating itself as the entire wealth of its substance. Then the final quote of the phenomenology of spirit and what we could call AK4, finally, quote, the goal, absolute knowing, or spirit that knows itself as spirit, form alike the inwardizing and the cavalry of absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits foams forth for him his own infinitude, end quote. And that is actually the final sentence and the final passage of the whole of the phenomenology of spirit. You could say the whole point of the book to work itself up to a knowledge of absolute knowing, which is a type of self-determining spirit. And again, sort of this metaphor of a chalice, the realm of spirits foaming forth as this insane infinity. All right. So, again, to summarize the entire philosophical drama, according to Hegel, you have modern philosophy as Cartesian thought up to pragmatic utilitarianism, working through Spinoza, working through Leibniz, the individualization of spiritual substance and the externalization of substance. Then you have Kant to Hegel, the whole of German idealism, as the transcendental will to the abyssal absolute and the self as negativity itself. And then you have absolute knowing as the entire journey of self-externalization as time to self-determination in absolute knowing, which abolishes time. And that, my friends, is the end and the conclusion of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807, perhaps one of the most important and one of the most essential philosophy texts ever written. If you've been with me throughout this whole journey, it's been about, I think I started doing these videos in October of 2018. It is now August of 2021. It has been a tremendous journey, summarizing and thinking through with Hegel all of the entire philosophical drama and the phenomenological drama of history. And if you haven't watched all the previous lectures, you can see them on the left-hand side there. I have covered the foreword, the introduction, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, and now absolute knowing. And there is a possibility that there will be another video summarizing this series. There is a preface, actually, that I could cover. We will see. But for now, I thank you for being with me through this journey. I hope this was a helpful overview that gives you a deeper grasp of Hegel's philosophy. Certainly a philosopher that deserves our attention and should be still contended with here in the 21st century. Hegel is far from dead, and much of future philosophy, I think, hangs on our capacity to think with him through the phenomenology of spirit.